Eve, that they would try and keep alive their father by going back to the garden and having a chat with the angels that actually guard it, who is this guy here, who in many accounts is the Archangel Michael. There's Seth there having a chat with him to see if he can get some of this stuff called the oil of mercy that drips, that oozes out of the tree of life itself, that quite obviously grows within the Garden of Eden, the earthly paradise, which is now out of bounds to humanity. You can't get there anymore. No one can get there. No human being has been there since Adam and Eve were chucked out. So he goes to the angel on the gate and says, you know, look, I know we're not allowed in there, but could you just sort of go over and get some of the oil of mercy so that we can give this to our father and keep him alive, because this brings immortality. The oil of mercy brings immortality. And Michael, as I said in many of the accounts, said, on your bike. But what I will give you is these shoots from the tree of life, which you can plant and they'll grow into a tree and you can do what you like with them. So this forms the earthly tree of life, which is different to the heavenly tree of life. But again, that's a story I won't go into tonight. That's a really, really interesting tradition which I can tell you about sometime. So, as I mentioned before, the Garden of Eden, the terrestrial or earthly paradise, was said to be where the 4 rivers of paradise took their course. Well, 2 of them I've mentioned already, the Tigris and the Euphrates. The other 2 are a matter of debate, but one of them is almost certainly the Arxes. The Arxes River flows eastward into the Caspian Sea and rises in the Armenian highlands, very close to some of the main sources of the Euphrates River. The 4th one is much more speculation. In my book, From the Ashes of Angels, and also in Gods of Eden, and in the new book, I essentially associate with the Great Azar River that rises just to the south of a major inland sea in this area known as Lake Valm. However, there is some traditions which I've uncovered which suggest that it actually rises at the same spot that the Arxes River rises and actually flows to the west. And this is really interesting because it then places 3 out of 4 of the rivers of paradise rising almost at the same spot. That's intriguing, and that's within the Armenian highlands. And there seems to be absolutely no doubt in my mind that the area of Eden, or the terrestrial paradise, is in eastern Turkey. You know, it is nowhere else, because the book of Genesis, the very start point of any search, any quest to find it, states that fact. So, you know, if you're looking for it in Antarctica or equatorial Africa, where is the evidence? Because the evidence clearly says that 2 out of 4 of those rivers are the Euphrates and the Tigris. So if your chosen selection for Eden is not on that river, it can't be real. I'm sorry. There are other biblical connections with this region. We've already talked about Shanlurfa, the city, beautiful ancient city, and tradition suggests that this was founded by the antediluvian patriarch Enoch, one of the descendants of Shem. However, that's not the only tradition. Others suggest it was built by Nimrod, the great hunter who built the Tower of Babel. Now, it's not suggested that the Tower of Babel was constructed at Shanlurfa, but there is definite connections of Nimrod with Shanlurfa and that region. There's lots of stories connected with him. And what's interesting also is that Nimrod is associated with the story of Abraham. There's some weird tales connected with battles and fights going on, that Abraham was going to be put to death by Nimrod, and God intervened and changed the fire that was about to engulf Abraham as he was put on this funeral pyre, and they became fish, and those fish became the carp in the pools of Abraham that you see today. Very, very strange story, but the connections are there again, strongly associated the book of Genesis and its original account with this area. Now there's something else which I'll just mention just for completeness, and I'll come back to this. There's also a story that it was founded by somebody called Orha, which is basically a play on the name Orha or Urha, which is the name of the city anyway, who was the son of Hiwa, and that means serpent, the son of the serpent, but I'll come back to that one. Just for completeness I mentioned all this. Right, and Haran, which is only a short distance, I can't remember the exact kilometres or miles at the moment, so I won't get it wrong, but only a short distance. It's about 20 minutes drive essentially from Shanlerfa. There are more biblical connections here, because although Haran itself only dates back to around 8,000 years, it is thought that the inhabitants, the original inhabitants, came from a nearby occupational mound or tell, which had been occupied for the previous 2,000 years before that. In other words, it goes back to 10,000 years. And this tell, which is not necessarily the one I took a picture of here just a couple of weeks ago, but it's in exactly the direction. When you stand at Haran, you take a picture towards the southeast, there's one occupational tell there, which looks as if it's probably not been excavated. And what are these tells? Basically, they're the build-up of human occupation over a very long period of time, possibly hundreds, if not thousands of years, and they eventually form these obvious mounds like this that are treasure troves to archaeologists, because they just dig down all the different layers, possibly 20, 30 layers of activity. And that's one of them you can see from Haran's own occupational mounds. But somewhere in that area, looking out over the Syrian border, by the way, which is only about 5 or so miles from Haran to the south. In fact, I've got a picture here of it. That's Haran from Google Earth, and this is the rough position of this location I'm going to talk to you about, which is Tel Idris. Now, Idris is the Arabic name for Enoch. So basically this is the mound or hill of Enoch. And this not only associates Haran with this antediluvian patriarch who's also connected with Shanlerfa, but Enoch was the writer of one of the strangest religious texts of all time, and that's the Book of Enoch, which obviously many of you will know. It was first translated into English at the beginning of the 19th century, having been found in Abyssinia, what is today Ethiopia, by James Bruce, a Scotsman. And this is a very, very strange tale. I mean, it's mentioned in part elsewhere, and it's also believed that it's derived in part from a few lines in the book of Genesis, chapter 6. But the story that's told in the book of Enoch is essentially this, that Enoch himself was lying down sleeping one night when two angels turn up, and they are given the name watchers. Well, in fact, the Hebrew term is irim, basically means those who watch, or in English, watchers. And they basically say to him, look, fancy a ride to the seven heavens? And he said, yeah, right then. And so they take him to the seven heavens. Now these are described in great detail within the book of Enoch. What Enoch says, I mean, there's volcanoes and seas and mountains and plains and all sorts of things like this. Now in theory this is some kind of heavenly abode, But what's interesting is that one of the 7 heavens includes the earthly paradise, where the 4 rivers of paradise take their source, and also the garden which contains the tree of life. It's actually referred to as the garden of righteousness in the book of Enoch. And bearing in mind that this garden is tended over by angels, they're the ones that look after it and guard it against us humans getting back in there, basically. And in another one of the 7 heavens, which is clearly not unconnected with the rest of them, is the abode of the angels. And it is whilst in this heaven with the abode of the angels that, probably another picture of that coming up, yeah, that Enoch sees a whole load of angels, these watchers, incarcerated within like this prison. And he says to his guides, who include the most obvious archangels, you know, Gabriel and Raphael and you know, the names which are so familiar to us today, he says, what have they done to deserve that? And he's told that they have transgressed the laws of heaven, because 200 of their number decided that they would descend down amongst mortal kind, and the implication is that they've descended down onto the top of a mountain and then gone onto the plains below, where they have taken mortal wives. But worse than this, they've revealed to them the arts and sciences of heaven. And in the book of Enoch, it lists long lists of these heinous crimes that these watchers, these rebel watchers as they're known, have actually committed. And you read through them, and what's interesting is that it is clear that you're talking about the rudiments of civilization, the very fundamental things that were given to humanity at the time of the so-called Neolithic Revolution. The changeover point from being hunter-gatherers to settled farmers, agriculturists, sedentary lifestyles and everything that goes with it. And that somehow there seems to be a possibility here that the story of the Watchers, although dismissed by Bible scholars, historians alike as mere fable, actually might contain a kernel of truth relating to the origins of civilization itself. I mean, the very area that we're talking about here now in southeast Turkey is where animal husbandry began. You know, the first pigs and the first cattle and sheep and the rest of it were domesticated in this region. But more importantly, this is where the revolution began, because at a place called Karajadar, and that's not the way that it's spelt, but that's the way that it's actually pronounced, which is a mountain that was once a volcano. Geneticists have been able to trace 68 modern strains of wheat used by us today for bread, for beer, for pasta, for cakes, etc, 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 all came from a wild form of wheat that grew, that still grows to this day on the side of this mountain, suggesting very strongly that this is where the domestication of wild wheat began. In other words, this is where agriculture started. And this is right in the area that we're talking about here. It's, you know, the Karajadar is just to the southwest of the city of Diyarbakir, the administrative centre of eastern Turkey. Some people call it Kurdistan. And it's just to the southwest of Diyarbakir, and essentially to the east of Llanlurfa, and not that far from Haran, basically. And the Watchers are said to have given us, for instance, metallurgy for the first time. Well, this is exactly the area where the first metals were worked, first beaten and eventually forged. But what I find curious is that it said that the Watchers gave women the ability to beautify themselves for the first time. In other words, they showed them cosmetics. And the earliest known cosmetics come from this same region. Evidence of the use of blue cobalt found within like these shells have been proposed. It's connected with a site called Abu Huraya, as far as I recall. This blue cobalt powder has been found, which is suggested that the women were beautifying themselves using this as early as around 7 to 8,000 BC. And what's also interesting is that in this same region, well, just to the west, I should say, in central southern Turkey, is where the earliest mirrors in the world have been found. And these, I photographed this just a few weeks ago in a museum at Konya in southern Turkey. These come from Çatalhöyük, which is the early Neolithic city in that region. And these are the first polished mirrors known in the world. They date to about 7,000 BC, and it's interesting, as a passing remark, that the Watchers are said to have given us the first mirrors. So, you know, you start to think, you know, are these Watchers, are they the prime movers? You know, some kind of elite, you know, some kind of driving force that was behind the Neolithic Revolution and existed maybe for a few thousand years and then gradually disappeared in some way. So, you know, is it possible that the story in the Book of Enoch relating to the Watchers, the rebel Watchers giving us the arts and sciences of heaven, is some strange memory of the Neolithic Revolution? You know, and did they trigger the Neolithic Revolution? And if this is the case, where really was Eden and the abode of the angels? Well, there's a clue at Haran. We keep going back to Haran, but this is a crucially important place and has been, as I said, for possibly as much as 10,000 years. And that's the fact that on the northern horizon, as you look from the occupational mount, you can see that there is a line of mountains. And on the top of one of those mountains is arguably the most important archaeological site to have been discovered in recent times. And we're talking about somewhere called Gobekli Tepe. And here's the map, just to give you some idea of, here's the Syrian border, here's Haran here, where I've shown you the pictures of and talked about. There's Llanlurfa there, and here is Gobekli Tepe. Gobekli Tepe is just a few miles outside of Llanlurfa, just to the northeast of it. If you get in a taxi, you're there in 20 minutes. That's how quickly it is, that's how close it is. So, what is Gobekli Tepe? Well, it's a series of stone sanctuaries, which include stone circles, that are on the top of a mountain, and around 4 of these sanctuaries have been fully explored so far. There's another 15 or 20 of them still to be uncovered. They're beneath a occupational mound or tell or tepe, which is the Turkish word for an occupational mound. And they are over 11,000 years old. This is just before the time of the Neolithic Revolution. In fact, the evidence seems to suggest that they were actually thrown up by hunter-gatherers, i.e. people whose time should have been occupied going off on the chase, hunting game, bringing back their food for their family, their social group. A nice easy lifestyle essentially, I should think. And yet some of them decided to give up all of that lifestyle and create the first monumental architecture in human history. Around 11,000 to 11,500 years ago, on the top of a mountain in southeast Turkey. And the forward-thinking archaeologist who uncovered this site for the first time in the mid-1990s, Professor Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute, he has basically turned on the head the whole concept of the Neolithic Revolution. Until recently, it was believed that the invention of agriculture and the settled lifestyle that that brought allowed us enough time to think about the life and universe and about religion and who we are and where we go in death. And that in turn led to the construction of the first temples and the infrastructure around temples that created the first cities and led to civilization. This was Gordon Childe in the 1930s, the prehistorian who came up with these ideas. He called it the Neolithic Revolution. But that's now been shown to be totally incorrect. In fact, there was a New Scientist article just a couple of weeks ago emphasising this, that Smith turned everything on his head, because what he said is that the temples came first and the infrastructure around the hundreds and thousands of people involved in their manufacture, their construction, their maintenance, their management, plus the